Hi, macro students. Welcome to our lecture about Module 6 about the circular flow diagram and the national accounts. So we're working with the question, how does the circular flow diagram help us to understand the economy? Now, we have seen the circular flow diagram before in our last unit. We have seen this right here before, but today we are going to expand on that and make it even more realistic to what our economy is actually like, because as we know, our economy has a lot more to it than just households and firms. And so we're going to start adding in more of those pieces. Okay, so let's start out by defining this term national accounts. So countries figure out and keep track of where and how much people, businesses, and the government are spending. And this is done for the whole country, like on that macro level. In our next module, we're going to get into one of those national accounts, which is called GDP. But for right now, we are just sticking with that term national accounts. So the circular flow diagram, it shows the flow of money in an economy. Now, if you look closely at this basic circular flow diagram, you will notice that this looks a little bit different than it did in our last unit. It's missing a couple of things. Did you figure it out? It is missing the arrows that in our last unit went in the other direction. So we had arrows that went from households to the factor market and back to the firms. Because the firms are giving households money, that's what these arrows represent, and in return, the households give those firms their labor. Remember that, right? We work, they give us money, we get that. And then over here, there's money going from the households to the goods and services or the product market back to the firms. And in return, like we give the businesses our money and they give us stuff, right? Things and services that we buy. And that all makes sense to us. But now we are just focusing on the flow of money. We're not focusing on the products and the labor, those other things that are flowing around. And because when we get to page 2 of our notes, we're going to be really happy that we only have the arrows representing the money. So you might want to add that in, right? Because you're good note takers, so you're going to want to add in something about money only on this diagram. That we took out the goods and services flow and we took out the labor on this diagram, and we're just showing the money. So let's go now to page 2. And right now, page 2 looks kind of weird, like what's going on here? But I'm going to show you. We're going to turn this little random collection of rectangles into this, which has a lot of arrows on it, because remember, all of the arrows represent money. So in a real economy, the money, it's flowing, and it's going to a lot of different places besides just the households and the firms. Now, here's what I tell my econ students when I show them this diagram, because a lot of econ students, they see this and they go, they see this and they're like, I'm done. I'm out of here. This is nuts. I don't know what's going on here, and I'm never going to figure it out. And then they take their poor econ textbook and they throw it out the window. All right, but here's, in all seriousness, guys, what I'm here to tell you is that you guys can figure this out. You use these powers of staring at it and thinking about it, and that will help you to understand it. You're not going to understand it the first time you see it, but I'm going to get you there. You're going to get yourself there. We'll get there. Okay? You can do this. Have some confidence. That's one of the big things that you'll learn in macroeconomics class, besides just macroeconomics. You will learn that you have the power to figure things out. Reading the diagram, reading the captions, you can figure this out. You got this. Okay. So let's go back to what you have in your notes. I hope that you didn't like try to write all that down already. We'll get there. I'm going to walk you through it. So in the middle here, we have our basic circular flow diagram. Okay, the one that we had on the other side of the page, the one that we had last unit. And so we had an arrow going from the factor market to the households, from the households to the market for goods and services, which we've been calling the product market. So let's add that in underneath it, product market. And then back to the firms and back to the factor market. Now, remember, every arrow represents the flow of money. Let's write that down. Over here. Every arrow represents the flow of money. Remember that. So because every arrow represents the flow of money, we're not going to just label every arrow as money because we need to get a little bit more detailed than that now. So what do we call the money that goes from the firms to the households? Well, we call that our paycheck, right? Or a term that we use more often is wages. So wages go from the firms to the households. And then what money do we have that goes from the households to that product market? Well, that is what we call consumer spending. When consumers, right, people, you and me, go to a store and buy something, that is called consumer spending. And by the way, it's the biggest part of the spending in our economy. So we're going to label this arrow here, and I'll zoom in for you. Consumer spending. Okay. Now, this product market is an interesting place because households are not the only people who buy stuff in the product market. We have talked before about my mother's business. She owned a realty company. She helped people buy and sell houses. And as a business, she needed to buy things for her office. She needed to buy desks and chairs and computers and copy machines and pencils and staplers and telephones and on and on and on, right? So businesses, they do, even though our original circular flow diagram didn't show this, well, now we're getting more detailed. Businesses do buy things in the product market. They really do. So we're going to show that businesses send money to the product market, and that will be an arrow going from our firms or businesses up to the product market. And that is that businesses buying things, we call that investment spending. So let's label that arrow investment spending. Investment spending. And let me tell you why. Because an investment is when you spend money to try to make money. When you spend money in hopes that that money that you're spending is going to grow and make you more money later. So when my mom owned her business, and when she went to buy a computer for her business, she was buying that computer because it would help her run her business and therefore make her even more money than the computer cost. And the same is true when she bought a pencil. She needed that pencil to help run her business, and it would help make her money. Same is true of all the chairs and the desks and everything else that she bought. So, whenever a business goes out into the product market and buys goods or services for their business, that is called investment spending. Because the reason they're spending that money is to try to help to make them money. So, maybe you want to make a little note of that, like what investment spending means. Investment spending equals businesses spending money for their businesses. Maybe you want to add some of those examples that I talked about, right? Examples, computers, chairs, desks, that kind of stuff. Okay. All right, so now we have those two arrows going into the markets for goods and services. Now notice up here, GOV''T, that's our abbreviation for government. Governments buy stuff too. Governments, they build buildings, they buy cars, they buy desks and computers and phones, right? There's government offices. Everything in those offices was bought by the government. That's government spending. So the government also goes into that product market and buys stuff, buys goods and services. So we're going to have an arrow going from the government into the product market, and we're going to label that arrow government spending. Okay, I'm going to pause the video here and create a part 2.